Jeffrey, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
I'm having a super fun time reading your book, Paper Bullets. It makes me feel in a way like I'm back in high school when the students used to harass each other with just little paper notes. But this is a more serious issue. I mean, this is a regular citizen harassing Nazi German soldiers, and it just influencing them enough to demoralize them. And it's just a very creative way to fight against the war. So I'm eager to talk about all that. But before we get to that, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about your background. You're a professor of history. How is it that you became a professor of history and then later on an author?
Well, I've always loved history, really for years and years, going back into high school, like you were saying. It has deep roots. I had some great teachers along the way, and I wanted to get into teaching, but I also really wanted to immerse myself in history. And so I went to graduate school after college, earned a PhD, and became a college professor. And part of that is also research and writing. And so it's a strange situation in a way. I feel like I've been very lucky that I can work at a job that I love, but also do another part of that, which is the writing and the research, which is part of the job, but it's also fun. And not everybody can say that they have fun at their job. So I feel very lucky to do that. So I was trained as a French historian, and I've written several books. I wrote a book about the reception of jazz music in Paris in the 1920s and 30s. I wrote a book about the Paris flood of 1910. And then I came to this project in large part by accident, really. My wife is an art historian, and she knew about the two women who are artists that I write about in the book. And she knew about them and told me a little bit about them and said, you should really check them out. And so the more I looked into the story, the more I realized that really nobody had written anything about it. And so I decided I wanted to write the book.
Well, I find peculiar you as a history teacher that you focus not necessarily on American history, but on European history, and you kind of focus on France or Paris, and then also a modern history, as opposed to most historians that I speak to. They speak about the Civil War or these time periods that practically change civilization. And not to say that modern history hasn't had a great influence in civilization, but I wonder what is it that led you towards, first of all, this geographical area, and secondly, about this time period?
Well, I think some part of it is the fact that my grandparents did a lot of traveling later in life, and they were not wealthy. They saved up money over the years, and when they retired, they decided they wanted to travel, and they had saved that money to be able to do that. And so they traveled, and they would bring back. They did a lot of travel in Europe, and they would bring back stories, and they would bring back souvenirs. They would bring back photographs. We used to, in the old days, you get out the slide projector and look at the slides when I was a kid. And so I think a lot of what I do really kind of connects back to them, and so it was a way to connect with them. And so when I got the chance to go to Europe, it sort of brought back a lot of the memories that I had from childhood. In terms of thinking about the modern period, I mean, you're right. There are so many different stories over the centuries that one can tell. But I don't know, there's just something about this period really kind of in the early 20th century that's always fascinated me. It's sort of hard to say exactly why, but I think the stories there are ones that have resonated with me. And that's really then where I started to focus my study when I was in graduate school, and I've just continued to do that today.
Well, I find I'm reading about your previous work, the book that you wrote on making jazz French. It just struck a chord with me because I'm a tango dancer, and at one time, tango was forbidden in Argentina, which is the cradle of tango, and it survived mostly because France took over, and there was a tango community in France that I guess it allowed for the survival of tango during this 40 years period in which it was illegal in Argentina. So I can see how France and Paris take all these cultural tendencies and even help them survive or magnify them. And well, that's the case also for jazz in France, which is people think of New York, but I could say that Paris was the second house of jazz.
Absolutely. And I think what you're talking about, both in terms of tango and in jazz, it really speaks to the kind of cosmopolitan nature of Paris in the 20s. So many different people from all over the world bringing their art, their music, their literature, their culture, their food, their dance, bringing that all together to Paris in that time period. And so, how could I not study that? Right? How could I
Right.
not be fascinated by that era and that moment? And so, when I was writing that book, I certainly came across the story of tango. I didn't write a lot about it, but I certainly knew a little bit about it. And you're right, it's an important story and one of so many different kinds of just rich tales that are there.
Another thing that I find peculiar about France and the history and the cultural movement is the coffee shop culture and having a space to think, which only recently in the last, I don't know, 10, 20 years, American is catching up with that, having a place where you can just go relax, have a conversation, drink a cup of coffee, and just expand your idea in a place that is not your home.
That's right. The cafe culture is so important, and I co-edited a book about that, about the importance of cafes in Paris and in Italy and in Vienna, and then other places as well. But those are sort of big hubs of European cafe culture. That book was called The Thinking Space, and my co-editors and I were really trying to sort of say, how is it that these cafes have provided a space for people to think, for creativity to happen, for collaboration to happen. And really, kind of to give birth to literature and poetry and music and all sorts of ideas. And so I think that those cafes they're sometimes overlooked, but you're right, they're so important as the kind of incubators of ideas and of innovation, of creativity. And so, Paris, is so important for that.
Okay, well, let's go into the synopsis of the book, Paper Bullets. I give us location, characters, and the circumstances of the time.
Right. So the book, the book begins in Paris because the two women that I write about were artists in Paris in the 1920s. They were lovers, they were stepsisters, and they were artistic partners. They worked together, collaborated on really amazing art. They were born, their birth names were Lucy Schwab and Suzanne Malherbe, but they're known better today by their artistic names. And so if you go to many major museums and galleries, you'll see some of their photographs, and the names that they produced their art under were Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore. And so, so you may see some of their work under those names. But it was really a partnership, both in their lives as a couple, as a loving couple, but also a partnership in the arts. They wrote, they drew, but really the thing they're most famous for are their photographs. They did these really sort of amazing avant-garde photographs in Paris in the 1920s, and they were part of that artistic scene that we were talking about a minute ago from the cafes and other spaces, creative spaces in Paris. But then they left and they moved to the island of Jersey, which is one of the Channel Islands just off the coast of France, but it's British territory. They went there because they wanted a peaceful life. They wanted to retire. Lucy had a lot of chronic illnesses, and they were just looking to kind of get out of Paris. By the 30s, Paris had become a very difficult place. Fascist groups were on the rise. Hitler, of course, had already come to power in Germany, Mussolini in Italy. So Paris was not a place they wanted to be anymore. So they went to Jersey, but and they thought that they were sort of escaping all the politics of the day. But of course, what happens is once the war starts and the Nazis move in, the German army moves into France, they also end up conquering the Channel Islands. It's the only bit of British soil that the German army conquers during the war. And it was really strategically important because it was right there off the coast of France, and they used it as a launching point for the Battle of Britain. And it was part of what Hitler called the Atlantic Wall. And it was the part of a defensive structure to prevent the Allies from taking back the continent. So with hundreds of, and actually thousands of German troops there on the island that they were living on, in the island of Jersey, they had a choice. They could either sort of sit back and do nothing, or they could flee, or they could resist. And they made the choice to resist. They made a choice to fight back in their own way, which, as you said earlier, it seems like a small way, writing notes. It doesn't seem like a very powerful kind of resistance. And yet it turned out to be a very powerful kind of resistance, and something that allowed them also to use their creative abilities and their creative skills as creators, as artists, as creative people. And so to write these notes, they wrote poems, they wrote songs, they wrote dialogues, they wrote jokes, they wrote sort of insults about the German leadership, and they would leave them around the island for the soldiers to find, hoping to demoralize the soldiers. So it's kind of an amazing story, and it's a story that most people have never heard of before.
Well, it sounds like something high schoolers will do to harass their schoolmates. But let me ask you, so I live in Montreal, and Montreal is, as far as sexuality, I think it's one of the gay capitals of the world. Here, being gay or being a lesbian is just as common as, liking the color red or black. It's not a big deal. But at this time in history, in the 1940s, I wonder how much acceptance was there for being a lesbian, and were they putting themselves at risk if people just knew that that's the kind of relationship that they had?
That's a great question. Paris in the 20s and 30s, when they were there, before they left and went to Jersey, it was sort of a mixed bag. In some ways, it was very open. Paris in the 20s, we think about the kind of the jazz age, the sort of what the French call les années folles, the crazy years. And part of that was a very kind of new openness, and that meant a new openness to sexuality. So there were definitely places where gay and lesbian folks could go and meet, and there was definitely a scene there. And so in many ways, they were open about who they were while they were in Paris. And yet at the same time, there was also kind of a concern, a fear on the part of a lot of people that lesbians and gay men were not doing their patriotic duty to have children, to bring, the next generation of Frenchmen, in particular, the next French army. There's always that fear of the next war. And so there was kind of a mixed bag. There were definitely criticisms, but there was a certain amount of openness. When they went to Jersey, though, that what's interesting about it is that because Suzanne's father had married Suzanne's mother had married Lucy's father. Sorry, I had to stop and think about that. They were actually stepsisters, and so that gave them a kind of cover when they went to Jersey, which was a much more conservative place. The idea of sort of being out lesbians in Jersey was not, I think, as possible for them, and so they were able to sort of use that cover as actual stepsisters, and that's how they talked about themselves. And of course, as far as the Nazis were concerned, the Nazis were very notorious for persecuting gay men, less worried about lesbians. But certainly the idea of gay folks, queer folks, were not something that the Nazis were interested in, and it was certainly looked down upon that. And so they really had to kind of hide that. And there was always that fear, that worry, because once as the war went on, they were captured, and they were interrogated and put in prison and put on trial for the crime of demoralizing German soldiers. And one of the things that they had to try to keep hidden was their relationship, because they were worried that the German army, if they found out the truth of their relationship, might that might have some serious repercussions for them.
Well, both Lucy and Suzanne were well-recognized artists for their photography, for their illustrations, for their writing, etc. But also they like to cross-dress or dress like men, and this is something that also is more prevalent today in culture. I wonder how much influence they had in culture by dressing like a man, for example. I mean, we hear about lesbians, but I don't know if that was so current to dress like a man at that time. I mean, Lucy, I think I saw some pictures of her where she shaved her head, and even today, that that is still that brings out stirs. So, but it's part of our culture today. But at that time, I don't know how much revolutionary that was.
Well, I mean, in a lot of ways, I think you're sort of getting at this point that they were really ahead of their time. And I think that a lot of people today, actually, queer folks and trans folks as well today, kind of look back to them as kind of precursors or as inspiration, and almost, sort of people who were paving the way. But I think at the time they were not, they were certainly part of the art scene. Excuse me, they were certainly part of the avant-garde world, but I think they were also still kind of seen as outliers too. I mean, they had a kind of rocky relationship with some members of the avant-garde art scene in Paris, which was a very masculine scene. A lot of those guys had served in the war. They were friends with the surrealists. The surrealists, you know, if you think about surrealist art, it's very strange, it's very dreamlike. A lot of those guys had been in the war, in World War I, and were sort of processing the experience of the war through their art. And so they were really kind of trying to rebuild masculinity. And so the idea of lesbians or gay men were sort of, you know, often looked down upon, even within the people that you would think might be open to that. So I think in a funny way, Lucy and Suzanne, as their artistic names of Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore, they were not especially influential in their day. I don't think they were known by this circle, but I think they were you know, they were kind of in that bubble. They didn't really kind of have a broader audience. And what's funny about them in a way is that they were kind of lost. They were kind of forgotten about, really until the 1980s when they were rediscovered. And people started to look at their work again and to write about them and do research and scholarship about them. But even then, the war experience was not written about. And that's why I wanted to write my book, because it's really focusing on the war experience, which I see very much as part of their whole trajectory. You know, all of their artistic work led up to that experience during the war, but it also comes out of, you know, who they were as a lesbian couple. I mean, I think I'd say in the book that I don't think either of them could have done this work alone. I think they needed each other, both in terms of the creative, you know, work that they did, but also just supporting each other, because this was a very dangerous and daring act that they undertook. You know, it seems, like we said, leaving notes seems like a small thing, but they were risking their lives because of who they were, but also because of what they were doing. To demoralize the occupation army was a serious crime. It was a capital crime. They were sentenced to death by a court-martial for this work.
Well, I have just one more questions about their identity, and then we will go a little bit deeper into the spine and the writing. But so Lucy changed her name to Claude Cahun, and Suzanne to Marcel Moore. I wonder why they did that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And a lot of people who've studied them over the years have sort of talked about the name change and tried to sort of make sense of that. And for me, I think it was several things. First of all, a lot of other people did that. They weren't the only artists who took on new names. I think that was something that was done, especially at that time, to try to create a kind of artistic identity, to separate kind of your private life from this kind of public role that you had as an artist. But I think for them, it was also, some of it was about the gender bending, you know, just like with cross-dressing. They were also kind of taking these gender ambiguous names. I mean, Claude is a name that in French can be used by both men and women. And so I think that was part of what Lucy was doing by changing her name to Claude. It was a way of saying she was neither man nor woman. She was kind of in between. She took Cahun, or Cahun, it's pronounced in French Cahun, but a lot of English speakers say Cahun. She took that name because that was the name of her maternal or her father's side of the family, but sort of her father's mother's side. So it had some connection back, and it was also it's the Hebrew, it's the French word for Cohen, which is the Hebrew for priest. So it was also kind of a connection back to her Jewish roots. So Lucy her father's family was Jewish. That was another reason why they were putting themselves at risk with the Nazis, because you know, if the Nazis had found out that she had Jewish roots, that would have been, you know, certainly a death sentence for her. And so I think there were a lot of reasons, partly about gender, partly about connecting with her Jewish past, because she was very close to her grandmother on her father's side, partly about sort of creating this new artistic identity. And I think another reason too is that Lucy's father and her uncle were both themselves very famous writers. So the name Schwab, that was her birth name, was connected to them. And I think also for her, at least, she wanted to establish kind of a sense of independence from them. I think she wanted to kind of get out from under that name and use a different name. And so it's a complicated story, but I think it served them in a lot of different ways. And so really they're known by those artistic names, Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore, much more today now than they were. Although in the book I talked about them as Lucy Schwab and Suzanne Malherbe, because that's how they talked about each other. Those are the names that they used themselves when talking about one another. They only ever used their artistic names when they were producing art. In private, in their writings, they always call each other Lucy and Suzanne.
Okay, well, then they find living in Paris is too stressful. It's not the lifestyle that they want to live. They move to Jersey because they want to retire, have a more pleasant life. Then the Germans invade Jersey, and they could have just waited out the war. I mean, they had a perfect covers. They were two sisters, and maybe not even bad looking. They were in their 40s. I mean, they would have just blended in society quite nicely, and they even knew, or they had the feeling that the Germans would lose the war. So, I mean, what was going on in their head that they decided to risk their life in in such a droll way to, I don't know which word to, but in such a way of writing paper notes. What do you think was going on in their head when they said to themselves, we're going to risk our life writing notes in something that we could just wait out?
Yeah, I think it's a really essential point, and it's something that, when I teach a seminar about fascism, and one of the questions that I sometimes ask my students, is to say, well, would you have been a resistor? And of course, everybody says, oh, yes, I would have been a resistor. But really, very few people were resistors during the war. When you think about the risk that people took to do that, most people would just go along. Most people would hide or close the door or, run away or do something, or just kind of sit back and not fight. Because to do so, to resist, is to put your life and limb at risk. And so it's a great question. Why would they do that then? Because they had money. They came from wealthy families. They didn't really have to worry about that. They had bought a nice house right on the beach overlooking the bay. They could certainly have just kind of sat back and relaxed. This is where I think, to me, you have to look at their whole life trajectory. And I think the way I talk about them in the book is that they really had been resistors for their whole lives. Going back to their youth, as a lesbian couple, when they were kind of pushing back against, this kind of more conservative French Catholic society that they grew up in. They were resistors in their artwork because they were, pushing the boundaries about what was beauty and what was femininity and what was, what was art. And I think, all of those things together. And then they also, had been engaged with radical politics as well. In Paris, they had befriended communists, they befriended other people on the political left. They had signed petitions. So they had already been politically active and engaged. They'd gone to meetings. They had been involved in political discussions in Paris, because Paris was very much a kind of political hotbed of conversation in the 20s when they were there. And so I think all of these threads of their life came together, sort of, their sexuality, their art, their politics, and, they made the choice. And I describe in the book a conversation, and this is all, everything that it's in the book is all coming from documents, from sources. This is all archival work, so this is completely nonfiction. But Lucy actually records a conversation that she and Suzanne have at one point about this question, about whether we should do something or whether we should just sit back. And they actually fight about it. And so you get this kind of moment in the book that, comes from Lucy's own remembrances of it, where they were not in agreement about whether they should do this. But I think that's where the love story kicks in. I think, Lucy said, I really want to do this. And Suzanne said, no, this is a bad idea. But eventually, Suzanne says, okay, I'll help you. I'll support you, because, they're a couple, they're life partners, and that matters to them. So I think it's the love story that also kind of is essential to understanding why they do it, and also how they do it, what gets them through it. Because like I said, I don't think they could have done it, either of them, on their own.
Right. Okay. Okay. This is a funny question. I'm sure you have thought about this in the past, and I also feel like no one have ever asked you this question. But let's say that you were in Jersey and you yourself wanted to resist the German occupation. And I'm going to come to how is it that they decided to resist by writing paper notes. But let's say yourself, you were living in Jersey and you wanted to resist the German occupation. What kind of means of resistance you will have used?
Well, there were other people on Jersey who resisted. So, they're not the only ones. And other people did also write some kind of notes. They wrote different types of notes, but other people did things like, going slow at work. A lot of people in Jersey ended up basically were forced to work for the German occupation, either by the Germans themselves or by the local Jersey government. So they were, they would work, as a mechanic or as a builder or as, something in the trades or construction. So to resist, some people would say, I'm just going to go slow. I'm not going to work very hard. I'm not going to work very fast. Some people certainly also, hoarded food or tried to steal from the Germans. There are always cases of sabotage, sort of taking out important parts of a car or a truck, so that it won't work. Some people did escalate, though. They tried to leave the island. They would get in boats. They would try to sail off, or paddle over to France, which is not that far away. And sometimes they made it, and frequently they didn't. They were rounded up and put in prison by the Germans. So there were a lot of different types of ways that people could resist. Note writing was certainly not the only one, and maybe not even, certainly not even the most common one. So in that sense, even though they're not the only ones writing notes, the types of notes that they wrote were very different. But there were other options. And yet at the same time, it's also important to remember that Jersey, it's an island in the middle of the English Channel. And even though it's part of this group of islands called the Channel Islands, it was still cut off. And so whatever resistance was happening on Jersey was happening purely kind of solo. It wasn't something, there was not a kind of connected, like the French resistance in France, right? Where people were working together, cells and groups, and they were coordinated. This was sort of individuals, sometimes families, who would, undertake some kind of action. And sometimes even whole families would be arrested because they had been involved in some kind of resistance work. Another thing that people would do too, that was a type of resistance, was that they would have an illegal radio. The radios were confiscated by the Germans because they didn't want people listening to the BBC. They were afraid that not only would they hear a different narrative about how the war was going, but they were also afraid that British military intelligence was sending secret messages through the BBC. So they confiscated everyone's radio, but most people had a radio that they had either hidden away or bought on the black market. And Lucy and Suzanne certainly did as well. But a lot of people, kind of were listening to those radios in secret. So that was another form of resistance. It may not have necessarily impacted the Germans, but it was a way to kind of, find some space that was disobedient for what the occupation authority was saying.
Okay, well, perfect. They are both artists. I wonder, and there are, like you mentioned, there are a million ways in which people can resist. How is it that they came to the conclusion that the best way that they could resist was to write paper notes or doing drawings or, funny messages?
Yeah, I think it really came out of their experience as artists, in Paris in the 20s and 30s. And interestingly, Lucy had written an essay back in the 20s about where she talks about how art functions and how it can have an impact on a viewer or on a reader. She talked about it as the indirect effect. And what she meant by that was this idea that, she said, if it's too bold, if it's too propagandistic, if it's too obvious, people will just ignore it. But if it's kind of a subtle message, if it's something that kind of works its way into your brain and makes you think, I think that was the idea, to make you think, right? To really sort of make you consider what your motivations or what are you doing. Then she said it would have an effect. And it was interesting that she wrote that essay long before they did this. So it was almost like she was kind of creating a theory or a kind of method. And then it turned out that they had an opportunity to put it into practice. So I think they've been thinking about these issues for a long time and how to kind of shock people or how to have an impact. And so when the opportunity came and they did in fact finally, after their argument, they decided, yes, we will do this. I think they said to themselves, well, what can we do? What tools do we have? They had a typewriter. They had a radio, so they could listen to the BBC, and some of their notes were actually just summaries of the BBC. They would write down what BBC was recording, and they would slip that to the German soldiers. And so I think it was partly the tools at their disposal and the creative abilities that they had, their political motivations and their personal motivations. And then this kind of idea, this theory that Lucy had created years ago. The thing about their notes, though, that are really important is that, and it really sets them apart, is that they were writing these notes in German to the German soldiers. So most other note writing that happened during the war, and there were plenty of other notes that were written, they were typically written to civilian populations saying, keep up your spirits, we'll win the war, kind of, in other words, they weren't written to the soldiers. So what sets them apart is that they were writing these notes in German to the German soldiers, and they took on a new identity. They would sign the notes as the soldier with no name. So they were essentially pretending to be a German soldier. This is another way in which they were kind of cross-dressing, so to speak, right? Except in their artistic creation of these notes, that they were becoming, so to speak, a German soldier, or pretending at least, and then writing these notes. And then the hope then was that these messages would get inside the minds of the German soldiers and have this indirect effect that Lucy had talked about, and make them think about it, make them think about why they were doing this, and maybe even want to desert or mutiny.
Right. Well, I see this not writing the way that they did it, adding an extra layer of danger, because they were actually in a disguised way delivering these notes to the soldier themselves. I wonder if you could tell us some of the ways in which they were delivering these notes to the soldiers.
Yeah, so what they would often do is, they would go shopping, or just go about their regular routine. So they'd have their shopping bag, and they would put some of these notes in their bag, or they would often wear these big bulky overcoats with very deep pockets, and they would stuff some of the notes down inside of their pockets. And so as they went around town, they would go to Saint-Hélier, which is the capital of Jersey. They would go shopping, and they would slip notes. They would leave a note. They would open up a car door and put it in, or stick a note on the windshield of a car. Or they would put them on a cafe table as they walked by. They would just kind of take a note out, slip it on the table, and keep on walking. Some of the notes they would put into magazines at the newsstand, German language magazines, so that when a German soldier would open it up, and think, oh, I want to buy this magazine, he would find this note. Some of them they would pin to a fence post, or put them in some other place. They put them in mailboxes, any place that they could find. And some of the notes took different forms. They would scratch on coins. They would scratch notes on coins and put them into the collection boxes, like a church or other places, anywhere that they thought somebody might find these notes. And the other thing that they did was, it turns out that their house was right next to a cemetery. And it was a cemetery where a lot of the German soldiers, any of the German soldiers who died during the war, were buried there. So they were literally feet from the German cemetery. They could see it out their window. So another thing that they did was that they started to make these wooden crosses, and they would write on the wooden cross, "For him, the war is over," and then run out during the dark after a soldier had been buried there, and they would plant this wooden cross with this message on the grave, so that other soldiers, when they came to visit and pay respects to their dead friend, that they would see this message, "For him, the war is over." Almost like the idea is that he's the lucky one. He's not here, in this horrible war anymore. He's been relieved from this horrible duty. So so many different ways. They would also make photo montage. They would clip things out of magazines and put them together and make new pictures and images. So any way that they could find to distribute that, they really let their imagination run wild, I think, when it came to figuring out what to say and how to say it and where to leave those notes.
And for how long were they doing this resistance?
They were doing this for 4 years.
Wow, 4 years.
Until they were caught, and then they were put in prison. And in many ways, that resistance continued while they were in prison. They befriended German soldiers. They continued to pass notes even while they were in prison. So they started, not long after the occupation began in 1940, and they continued on pretty much until the end of the war.
Wow. And one of the notes that I find that caught my attention was this: Jesus is great, but Hitler is greater, because Jesus died for people, but people died for Hitler. So I thought that was funny, or make me think or reflect for a minute. But I wonder if you could share one of the ones that you think is more curious to you.
Well, I mean, that one actually is one of my favorites, because the Jesus or Hitler is greater than Jesus because Jesus died for people, but people died for Hitler. That was actually when they hung up as a banner. They painted it on a huge banner and hung it up in the church that was right next to the graveyard that was right beside their house. So, it's really sort of remarkable, this image of them painting this banner and rolling it up and carrying it, a few hundred yards down the road to the church, and then somehow, climbing up and hanging it above the altar in the church. That's a pretty remarkable, thing that they do. Some of the language that they would use, they would say, the cowards of the German army, they would really talk about it in very, blunt terms. But then other times they would write like a dialogue where they were pretending one soldier was speaking to another. And they would say things like, that he can't go home to visit his family. A lot of the notes were about family, kind of reminding the soldier, or making them think like, why are you here occupying this island? You should be at home with your children. You should be at home with your wife. You shouldn't be here messing around with our lives. You should be taking care of, if you were a real man, they were sort of playing on this idea about masculinity. If you were a real man, you'd be at home with your family. You wouldn't be here as some sort of conquering, you're not much of a conquering hero. You're really, you've been fooled. I think that's the other thing that's interesting. A lot of the notes talk about trying to tell the soldiers that Hitler has fooled you into doing this, that this is not a worthy enterprise. And so in some ways, some of my favorite notes are the ones, I love the funny ones, but some of the ones that I think are the most poignant are the ones that really kind of hit the note about family, and really kind of make people think about that. It was clear that they were really trying to get at the personal feelings of the soldiers, that they saw them as people, they saw them as human beings, even though they were an occupation force, even though they were, a German army, even though they were Hitler's men. Lucy and Suzanne were still able to see these soldiers as human beings and to try to relate to them on that level. And I think that's actually a pretty remarkable thing when you think about it.
Okay, well, let's do this. Let's share this information with the listeners. They get caught, they get sentenced to death, and then to find out what happened next, they had to go and buy your book. So I wonder if you could tell us one more time the title of the book and where can the listeners follow the work that you're doing?
So the book is called Paper Bullets, Two Artists Who Risked Their Lives to Defy the Nazis. It's out in paperback. Here it is right here in paperback. And you can find out more about the book and about me, my website, jeffreyhjackson.com, and also on Twitter at jeffreyhjackson. And I've been doing a lot of events. I've got lots of info on the website. I'm going to be doing a lot more events this year in 2022. Podcasts like this one and some other talks and things. So if people want to find out more, they can tune in online or come see me. I'll hopefully be doing some in-person events later on. So we'll see how that goes, if everything goes according to plan.
Jeffrey, thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, Elena.